I stood in the wreckage of what was once my thriving garden, the soil poisoned, my home stolen out from under me, and my neighbors bullied into silence. The HOA had manipulated the system, crushing hard-working people under the weight of their greed. Watching Reynolds smirk as she flaunted her unchecked power, I clenched my fists. They thought they could get away with it, that no one would fight back. But their arrogance would be their downfall. I wiped the sweat from my brow, stepping back to admire the rows of tomatoes, peppers, and basil thriving in the makeshift garden that covered my driveway. What had started as a desperate attempt to put food on my table had turned into something more, a quiet defiance against circumstances that had tried to break me. My name is Abraham, and for the past 6 months, this garden has kept me going. When I lost my job at the auto plant, I didn't waste time feeling sorry for myself. I grabbed old pallets, bargain bin soil, and every seed I could afford, transforming the slab of concrete outside my rental into a lush, life-sustaining oasis. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about survival. I had neighbors who saw what I was doing and admired it. Mrs. Gonzalez, from 2 doors down, often traded her homemade empanadas for a handful of fresh basil. Even Raj, who barely had time to chat, gave me a knowing nod whenever he passed. But not everyone appreciated my efforts. As I wiped my hands on my jeans and turned toward the house, a sleek black SUV slowed in front of my driveway. I knew that car. And I knew trouble was coming. The black SUV idled for a moment before rolling to a stop in front of my driveway garden. I clenched my jaw, already bracing for whatever nonsense was coming my way. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped none other than the self-appointed queen of the Pinecrest Hills HOA, Eleanor Whitmore. Dressed in her usual pristine beige pantsuit, clipboard in hand, she took in the sight of my garden with a look of pure disgust. She exhaled sharply, like the very air around my tomato plants offended her. "Mr. Abraham," she began, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "we need to discuss this situation." She gestured vaguely at my garden beds, as if they were piles of trash instead of thriving vegetables. I folded my arms, already feeling my blood pressure rise. "It's not a situation. It's food." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Be that as it may, Section 123 of the HOA regulations states that all visible landscaping must be approved by the board. And this," she motioned to my carefully cultivated rows of green, "does not meet community standards." Frustration burned in my chest. My fists clenched at my sides. "Community standards?" I repeated, incredulous. "This is my driveway. My property. These plants are feeding me, Eleanor. Are you really going to stand there and tell me that's a violation?" She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile a person gives when they've already decided they're going to win. "Rules are rules, Mr. Abraham. You have 7 days to remove this eyesore, or fines will begin at $100 per day, doubling each week." The words hit like a slap. 7 days. She was threatening to take away the only thing keeping me afloat, all because some rich folks in the neighborhood didn't want to see food growing outside their pristine homes. Behind her, my neighbor Raj watched from his porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "We'll see about that." Eleanor smirked. "Yes, we will." As she strutted back to her SUV, I stared at my garden, fury simmering beneath my skin. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, sleep was out of the question. I sat at my kitchen table, the eviction notice Eleanor had so smugly delivered sitting next to my untouched dinner. My fists clenched and unclenched as I replayed the day's events over and over in my mind. 7 days. 7 days to rip out the only thing keeping me afloat. It wasn't just my garden, it was my lifeline. Every tomato I grew meant one less I had to buy. Every zucchini and pepper stretched my dwindling savings a little further. I had lost my job, but I hadn't lost my ability to survive. Until now. I grabbed the HOA rule book from the drawer where it had sat since I moved in. Back then, it was a thin, sensible document, nothing more than a few pages outlining basic neighborhood guidelines. But when I flipped through it now, I barely recognized it. The landscaping section alone had ballooned into a monster, 26 pages of regulations, amendments, and loopholes so convoluted they could make a lawyer dizzy. Then I saw it. Section 123. The exact one Eleanor had thrown in my face today. But something was off. The wording wasn't about gardens. It wasn't about temporary structures or food production. It specifically referenced permanent modifications. My garden beds sat on top of the driveway. They weren't dug into the ground. They weren't permanent. A slow grin crept onto my face. I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to fight smart. The next morning, armed with my phone camera, I took pictures of every inch of my garden, noting that none of the structures violated the HOA's own bylaws. Then, I walked around Pinecrest Hills, snapping photos of all the other rule breakers Eleanor conveniently ignored. Basketball hoops, decorative flags, oversized mailboxes, unapproved lawn ornaments, violations were everywhere. And then I spotted the crown jewel of hypocrisy, Eleanor's massive, gaudy, water-wasting fountain. I let out a low chuckle. If they wanted to play by the rule book, I was about to show them exactly how that game was played. 3 days later, I caught them in the act. I had been keeping a close watch, ever since I noticed Eleanor circling my property in her pristine white Lexus like a vulture waiting for something to die. But today was different. Today, she had backup. From my front porch, I spotted them the moment they arrived, 3 men in matching navy polo shirts with HOA enforcement embroidered on the chest. They moved with calculated precision, wielding laser measuring tools and clipboards like weapons. I barely had time to grab my phone before they were already in my driveway, slapping bright orange violation stickers onto my garden beds. I stepped outside, my pulse quickening. "Can I help you?" The tallest of the 3, a gray-haired man with a military-style buzz cut, barely looked up. "Routine inspection." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. I crossed my arms, heart hammering against my ribs. "Inspection for what?" "My garden's not breaking any rules." He clicked his measuring tool, jotting something onto his clipboard. "Driveway modifications exceed the 25% allowable coverage." I scoffed. "There's nothing in the bylaws about driveway percentages." A smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth as he handed me a document. "New amendment. Passed last month." I scanned the paper. The ink was fresh. The date? Today. My blood ran cold. They were making up rules on the spot. A movement across the street caught my eye, Eleanor, leaning against her car, watching with arms folded, an all-too-satisfied grin on her face. Then, as if the day couldn't get worse, one of the enforcement officers stepped out of my backyard. "Sir, your compost bin is oversized. Also, your rain barrel isn't on the approved materials list." I felt my stomach drop. "You went into my backyard? That's private property." No response. Just another smirk. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. They were baiting me, waiting for me to lose my temper. I clenched my fists. "Not today, Eleanor." But something told me the worst was yet to come. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The street was quiet, too quiet. No kids playing, no dogs barking, just the low hum of streetlights buzzing against the night air. I stood at my window, watching as Eleanor's Lexus idled across the street. She wasn't alone this time. A second car, dark and unfamiliar, was parked a few houses down, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the HOA regulations for the 100th time, my eyes flicking between the screen and the cars outside. My stomach tightened with every line I read. The bylaws they were citing against me weren't just selective, they were vague, contradicting older clauses that actually protected homeowners. I was being targeted, and they were getting sloppy about hiding it. At 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor lights in my garden flared on. I bolted up from my chair and rushed to the window just in time to see two figures in dark clothing crouched by my tomato beds. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them uncap a bottle and pour something into the soil. Poison. A surge of rage shot through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Instead, I reached for my phone and pulled up the security camera feed. The grainy night vision footage showed exactly what I feared: two men, both wearing the same Navy HOA enforcement shirts from earlier that day. I recorded every second. By morning, the damage was undeniable. The once vibrant green leaves of my tomato plants had shriveled into lifeless brown husks. My lettuce had collapsed in on itself, and the peppers looked like they'd been set on fire. I clenched my jaw so tight it hurt. They wanted to break me, to make me give up and leave quietly. Instead, they had just given me exactly what I needed: proof. This wasn't about rule enforcement. This was war. And I had no intention of losing. I stood in front of the community center, the weight of my fight pressing heavy on my shoulders, but tonight, I wasn't alone. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs as more and more neighbors gathered around me, some hesitant, others determined. People I had never spoken to, people I had only waved at in passing, were here because they'd seen what was happening. They'd seen the destruction of my garden, the bogus fines, the intimidation tactics. And they knew, if the HOA could do this to me, they could do it to anyone. Mrs. Gonzalez, the elderly widow from 3 houses down, stood at my side, gripping her cane like a sword. "They fined me last year for my porch plants," she muttered. "Said they weren't aesthetically consistent." Tom, the father of 3 from Oak Street, stepped forward. "They made me remove my daughter's tree swing. Called it an unauthorized structure." The stories poured out. One by one, people began to realize they weren't just isolated victims, they were part of a pattern. A strategy. The HOA wasn't about maintaining the community. It was about control. And tonight, that control was about to crack. I took a deep breath and raised my voice so everyone could hear. "They poisoned my garden," I said, holding up the lab results proving the soil contamination. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "They did it because I fought back. Because they wanted me gone." Silence. Then Raj stepped forward, fists clenched. "So what do we do about it?" A slow, steady confidence built inside me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for all of us. "We hit them where it hurts," I said, pulling out a thick folder of evidence. "We expose every violation they've ignored. Every shady deal they've made. We take this to the media, the city council, the courts if we have to. But most importantly, we stand together." A fire ignited in the crowd. People nodded, some clapping, some muttering words of agreement. Tonight wasn't just about justice for my garden. Tonight was the beginning of a revolution. The next morning, I woke up with a plan, and this time, I wasn't playing defense. As I sat at my kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, I flipped through the thick folder of evidence we had gathered the night before. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was Tom's, Mrs. Gonzalez's, Raj's, and dozens of others who had been fined, harassed, and bullied by the HOA. This wasn't about gardening violations. This was about power, greed, and a system that had been designed to keep people afraid. I opened my laptop and started typing. The email was direct, the subject line bold: HOA corruption in Pinecrest, urgent news story. Within the hour, I had sent it to every local news outlet, investigative journalist, and community watchdog I could think of. I attached copies of the soil test results, the property records, the proof of selective enforcement. I even included a few of Mrs. Gonzalez's photos, ones that showed HOA board members violating the very rules they used to punish the rest of us. Raj arrived at my house just as I hit send. He was holding a box of freshly printed flyers. "We're taking this to the streets," he said with a grin, slapping a flyer onto my table. It read, "Know your rights. Is the HOA targeting you?" Below was a list of common HOA abuses, along with a time and place for a community meeting. By noon, our flyers were posted on nearly every lamppost, bulletin board, and community mailbox in the neighborhood. Residents peeked out from behind their curtains, watching as we stapled them in place. Some hurried out to take one, their expressions shifting from curiosity to anger as they read the details. I could feel it, something was shifting. That afternoon, I got a call from Channel 7 News. "We're interested in your story," the reporter said. "Can we come by for an interview?" I looked outside, where a group of neighbors had gathered, sharing their own HOA horror stories. "Yes," I said, a slow smile forming. "You're going to want to bring a camera." The morning of the HOA meeting felt different. There was a charge in the air, an undercurrent of something brewing just beneath the surface. It wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. The community had finally woken up. As I walked toward the Pinecrest Community Center, I saw them, dozens of neighbors gathered outside, holding signs, some with pictures of my destroyed garden, others with bold letters reading, "Stop the corruption," and "Our homes, our rights." The people the HOA had bullied for years had finally found their voices. Inside, the meeting had already started, but tonight, the usual smugness on Mrs. Reynolds' face was absent. Her eyes flickered nervously as she glanced at the packed room, the news cameras in the back, the microphones already set up. She knew. She could feel it. The control she had clung to for so long was slipping. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'd like to address the board regarding the destruction of my legally protected garden," I said, my voice steady but strong. "This meeting is about property standards," Mrs. Reynolds interrupted, her voice laced with forced authority. "No," I countered, holding up a copy of the county ordinance. "This meeting is about abuse of power." I handed out the evidence, documents, photos, signatures from neighbors who had been targeted. The soil test results proving sabotage. The security footage of her enforcers trespassing on my land. But the real dagger came when I placed a thick manila folder onto the table in front of her. "These," I said, flipping through the documents, "are property records showing multiple sales under Pinecrest Capital LLC. The same company registered to Marcus Williams. The same company that has been quietly buying up homes on the north side." Gasps filled the room. The news cameras zoomed in. "You weren't enforcing rules," I said, my voice calm and cutting. "You were running a real estate scam." For the first time in her reign, Mrs. Reynolds was speechless. The HOA wasn't just losing control tonight. It was collapsing, brick by corrupt brick. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time in years, the Pinecrest HOA board sat frozen, their usual arrogance stripped away under the weight of undeniable truth. The documents on the table weren't just accusations, they were proof. Proof of corruption, proof of manipulation, proof that they had been weaponizing rules not to maintain the neighborhood, but to dismantle it for profit. Mrs. Reynolds' face had gone pale, her usual polished confidence reduced to clenched fists and a thin, trembling mouth. Marcus Williams, the HOA president, sat rigid, his eyes darting toward the exit as if debating whether to make a run for it. But there was nowhere to run. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were taking notes, and the entire community was watching. "I think we've heard enough," an elderly man in the back, Mr. Abernathy, said, standing up. He had been one of the HOA's biggest supporters for years, but now, even he looked disgusted. "This isn't about property values. It's about greed." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This is slander." Mrs. Reynolds snapped, finding her voice again. You have no authority to. We have every right to know how our neighborhood is being run, interrupted Linda, a single mother who had been fined for having a laundry line in her backyard. And we're done being bullied. One by one, neighbors stood up. The Johnsons, who had been fined for a disabled access ramp. The Martinez family, who had been harassed for their children's sidewalk chalk drawings. The elderly couple fined for wind chimes. You targeted us, Raj said, stepping forward. But you got sloppy. You pushed too far. And now, you're going to answer for it. A slow, deliberate clap echoed through the room. It was the local news anchor. I'd love to ask a few questions, she said, stepping forward with a microphone. For the first time in her life, Mrs. Reynolds had no words. She had built a kingdom of fear, but tonight, that kingdom was burning. And the people she had oppressed were the ones holding the torches. The air in the community center was thick with tension, but this time, it wasn't fear, it was power. Real power. The kind that came from people standing together, no longer willing to be silenced. Abraham stood at the front of the room, his hands resting on the stack of documents that had finally cracked the foundation of the HOA's corruption. Just days ago, he had been nothing more than a struggling homeowner fighting to save his garden. Now, he was leading an entire neighborhood in reclaiming their rights. You think you can intimidate us into silence? Abraham's voice rang through the hall. You think you can use fear and fines to control us? That ends today. Mrs. Reynolds sat stiffly, her carefully cultivated poise unraveling with each second. Marcus Williams, who had once held the community in the palm of his hand, looked ready to bolt. The entire board had once ruled with impunity, hiding behind legal jargon and vague regulations, but now they were exposed, their crimes laid bare for the entire town to see. The community had rallied behind Abraham, and with every revelation, every undeniable proof of fraud, backroom deals, and targeted harassment, their voices grew louder. The final blow came when the local news reporter, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke up. So, just to be clear, she said, stepping forward, microphone in hand, you knowingly fined certain homeowners, selectively enforced HOA rules, and attempted to drive down property values in order to purchase land at a discount for your personal development project? Mrs. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. That is an outrageous claim, she huffed. Then why did you tell donors at your campaign event that they would see a 300% return on investment once Pinecrest Hills was rezoned? Abraham countered, holding up a transcript of her own words, recorded in secret by Mrs. Gonzalez. Gasps filled the room. Whispers turned to murmurs, then to open outrage. We've been played, Mr. Abernathy muttered, shaking his head. This is a betrayal, Linda said, voice shaking. All these years of fines, warnings, and threats, and it was all just a scheme. A slow ripple of applause started at the back of the room. Then another. And another. Until the entire room was standing, clapping, shouting, demanding justice. It wasn't just about Abraham's garden anymore. It was about every family that had been targeted, every elderly homeowner who had been pushed out, every person who had felt powerless under the weight of the HOA's greed. Abraham turned to the news cameras. This isn't just happening here, he said. HOAs like this exist all over the country, exploiting loopholes, targeting people who don't have the resources to fight back. But we fought back. And we won. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. HOA president exposed in corruption scandal. Pinecrest Hills residents fight back, and win. By noon, official investigations were launched, the rezoning application was pulled, and Mrs. Reynolds had formally resigned from her campaign. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Hills belonged to the people again. And Abraham, standing in the middle of his newly restored garden, knew this victory wasn't just his, it was everyone's. The morning after the scandal broke, Pinecrest Hills felt different. Lighter. As Abraham stepped outside, he noticed something he hadn't seen in years, neighbors smiling, greeting one another without the lingering shadow of the HOA watching over them. The iron grip of fear had been shattered, and in its place, something stronger had taken root: hope. News vans had packed up and left, but their impact remained. The fallout from the HOA's corruption had been swift and merciless. Marcus Williams had resigned, retreating into the shadows after realizing he had no allies left. Mrs. Reynolds, once the untouchable queen of Pinecrest Hills, had vanished overnight, her campaign office emptied, her pristine front lawn now littered with "for sale" signs. She hadn't even shown her face at the last emergency HOA meeting, the one where the board officially disbanded. There was nothing left for her to control, no power left to wield. But the greatest victory wasn't in their defeat, it was in what the neighborhood had become. Abraham's home had once been a target, his garden a battleground, but now it stood as a symbol of resistance. The plants, once poisoned and left for dead, were thriving again, thanks to the hands of neighbors who had refused to let the fight be just his alone. Tomatoes stretched toward the sun, peppers ripened in the heat, and in the center of it all, a brand new wooden sign had been planted by the community: Pinecrest Gardens, grown by the people, for the people. More than just a legal win, this was a cultural shift. Neighbors who had been strangers before were now allies. Families that once feared their HOA were now talking about how they could use this land, not for rules and restrictions, but for something good. Plans for a neighborhood market were in motion. A community tool shed was being built. Even Mrs. Gonzalez, at 82 years old, was teaching children how to grow herbs in tiny pots on their windowsills. As Abraham knelt in the soil, running his fingers through the earth that was finally his again, he realized something: they hadn't just defeated an HOA. They had reclaimed their home. And nothing, not fines, not threats, not even the ghost of Mrs. Reynolds, could take that away. The transformation of Pinecrest Hills wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about rebuilding a true community, one rooted in unity and resilience. The HOA's reign of fear had crumbled, but in its place, something remarkable had grown. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now stood together, stronger than ever. The empty lots that Reynolds and her cohorts had planned to bulldoze for their high-end development. They were now brimming with life, converted into thriving community gardens where children learned to plant their first tomatoes, and elderly residents like Mrs. Gonzalez shared generations-old gardening wisdom. On the first official, Pinecrest Community Day, Abraham stood back and watched as families gathered, laughter echoing through the streets that once felt suffocating under HOA rule. A makeshift farmer's market had popped up along the sidewalks, baskets overflowing with fresh vegetables grown by the very people who had once been fined for doing the same. Even the most skeptical neighbors, those who had once feared fighting back, now walked with their shoulders squared, empowered by what they had achieved together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Abraham smiled. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a family. And they had won, together.